Welcome to the second part of reproduction in plants. So in the last class we talked about pollination, and we'll talk about different factors that they end fertilization, pollination, and we'll go on to fertilization. So when we talk about pollination, it is the transfer of pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. There are two types of pollination, as we have discussed in the last class: self-pollination and cross-pollination, and so on. So we'll talk about some of the factors that pollination depends upon. What are they? The factors that pollination depends are the wind, the water, the insects, birds, and other animals. They help in the transfer of pollen grains. They help in the pollination. So they are therefore called agents of pollination. So what are the agents of pollination? Wind, water, animals, birds, insects, and so on. These are the external agents of pollination. So depending on the external agents of pollination, pollination is classified into various groups. The first one is pollination by insects, or insect pollinated flowers. So pollination by insects is called entomophily. It is known as entomophily, the pollination with the help of insects. Like, for example, bee. You must have seen bee buzzing around in the garden. What is it there for? Actually, it's there for the nectar. So what happens is, it is the most common, the pollination by insects, or entomophily, is the most common type of pollination that takes place. Insects such as bees and butterflies visit flowers to collect the nectar, actually. So as it visits one of the flowers, what happens is the pollen grains will be dropped at the back of on the body of the insect, bee or butterfly or whatever. Okay, now that bee will go to another flower carrying the light pollen grains. So as it goes in search of the nectar to another flower, but of the same species, what will happen? It might drop some of the pollen grains from its body on the stigma of the flower. So therefore, pollination takes place. So this type of pollination takes place with the help of insects, is known as entomophily. And some of the examples of insect pollinated flowers are salvia, rose, marigold, and so on. Now, what type of flowers does it have? The insect pollinated flowers, they are large. The insect pollinated flowers, they are large, brightly colored, and often scented. Why scented? Because it has to attract the insects with its scent. And it produces nectar. So, and some of the flowers that are sweet smelling and produces nectar is called jasmine. Okay, so these are some of the characteristics of insect pollinated flower. Now we go on to the wind pollinated flower, or pollination by the wind. So pollination by wind is called entomophily. Entomophily is the pollination by insects, and by wind it's called entomophily. So flowers and plants such as rice, maize, and grasses are pollinated by wind. So the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma of the flower with the help of wind. So wind carries the pollen grains from one flower to the other. So this type of flower is called wind pollinated flower. So most of the wind pollinated flower, they are small and inconspicuous. It does not have any nectar. It does not have any scent. It is dull colored. Okay. But it has large feathery stigma and a large feathery anther. So the most of the wind pollinated flowers are small and have dry and light pollen grains, which is easily carried. Their pollen grains are very light. They can be carried by the wind to large distances. And pollen grains are produced in very large quantities. The style projects out and they are feathery, as I already told you. And the pollen grains that flies, the pollen grains that is carried by the wind, as it comes to the near the feathery stigma, it will get stuck to the stigma, and then what takes place? The pollination takes place with the help of wind. So this is all about anemophily. Now there is a difference between the wind pollinated flower and the insect pollinated flower. That's what we'll discuss right now. The petals are large in the insect pollinated flowers. The petals are large and brightly colored. The petals are large and brightly colored. In the wind pollinated flowers, the petals are small and dull colored. Usually it is white. In insect pollinated flower, they produce scent. They produce scent to attract insects, but wind pollinated flower, they do not produce any scent. Similarly, the wind pollinated flower, as it produces nectar, it produces scent, it produces nectar as well, whereas the scent as well as nectar is missing in the wind pollinated flower. In the insect pollinated flowers, the anthers have short filaments. They are very, very short filaments to facilitate the dropping of pollen grains on the back of the insects. Whereas in the wind pollinated flowers, anthers are attached to a long filaments, and it helps to expose the anthers to the wind so that the pollen grains are carried away from the flowers to another, from a flower to another flower. Pollen grains are produced in very small quantities in case of insect pollinated flowers, but in case of wind pollinated flowers, it produces a lot of pollen grains. They produce pollen grains in large quantities. Insect pollinated flowers, now here the stigma is sticky or knob-like, whereas in the wind pollinated flower, the stigma is large and feathery. Okay, so we have discussed the wind pollinated flowers and the insect pollinated flowers and the differences. Now we go on to the water pollination by water, or water pollinated flower, which is known as pollination by water, is known as hydro. Hydro means water, hydrophily. So it occurs in aquatic plants such as hydrilla, vallisneria, two types of not only these are just the examples of two aquatic plants. Flowers pollinated by water is very light so that they can easily float on the surface. So the flowers are very, very light so that it floats on the water, and they do not produce any nectar. Pollen grains are produced in large quantities in the case of wind pollinated flowers, and in water pollinated flowers, or hydrophily also is the same thing here. It produces large number of pollen grains. So the male and female flowers are usually produced on separate plants. So they have a male plant and the female plant bearing male flowers and female flowers respectively. In vallisneria, a male flower is submerged in water. On maturity, it gets detached and floats to the water. The female flower has a long stalk that too floats on the surface of the water. So when the male flower comes in contact with the female flower, there is a transfer of pollen grains. So that's how the pollination takes place with the help of water. Now the last type of pollination is pollination by animals and birds. So birds, squirrels and bats, they also act as a pollinating agents. So when they suck nectar from the flowers, so in such cases, the flowers, what type of flowers are the animal pollinated flower? The flowers are usually large and brightly colored, growing on tall trees, for example, silk cotton tree. So the flowers are usually very, very large. Now we talk about artificial pollination. Pollination can be done artificially as well. Now, why is artificial pollination done? We will talk about it now. The artificial pollination is performed to produce a new variety of plant which contain the required characteristic, the type of characteristics that we want. In this process, two different varieties of crop plants with a desired characteristics are selected. For example, one variety may be high yielding and the other disease resistant. Okay, one variety is produces high yield of fruits or whatever, and the other plant is disease resistant. So after selection of these kind of varieties, the cross breeding is done. So the cross breeding is done by artificial pollination to get the variety of plant which has the characteristics of both the plants, the disease resistant as well as high yielding variety. So this process is known as hybridization. This process is no artificial way of pollinating to get a desired variety of a plant is called hybridization, and the new variety is called the hybrid. So the new variety of plant that we get after hybridization by artificial pollination is known as hybrid. So many hybrid high yielding varieties of wheat, rice, maize has been produced by the process of hybridization. So that was all about hybrid pollination, the natural pollination, wind pollinated flower, wind pollination, animal pollination, insect pollination, water pollination, and so on, and artificial pollination. Now we come to fertilization. Now what is fertilization? Let me tell you, the fusion of the male and the female gamete in any sexual reproduction is known as fertilization. Here we are talking about plants. So the pollen grains produces male gametes and the ovary produces the female gametes. Now there has to be the fusion. There is a process of fusion of male and the female gamete to produce a single cell called zygote. This is called the fertilization. Now how does fertilization take place? So for that we have to understand the structure of the pollen grain. So I have already done the structure of the pollen grain on the board. So this is the entire thing is a pollen grain, and of course the pollen grain is very, very small and very, very light. Okay, this is enlarged billions of times to have a larger diagram of the pollen grain here on the board. We have small spaces here. This is the protective layer, hard protective layer. Okay, this is the hard protective layer which covers the pollen grains, so that and it is spiny, so that it sticks to the stigma. Okay, now we have some holes, small tiny pores, which is known as the germ pore, and from one, as the pollen grain sticks to the stigma of the flower, what happens is that it produces pollen tube. This is the pollen tube. As you can see, this entire thing is the pollen tube. Okay, so the pollen tube now extends from one of the germ pores, in which the nuclei divides into two parts, the male nuclei and the tube nucleus. The nucleus, it has a single nucleus in the pollen grain. Now as it enters, the nucleus enters into the pollen tube, it breaks into two. One is the male nuclei or the male gametes, and another one will be the tube nucleus. So over here, as we talk about here, now we come here to the diagram. This is the tube nucleus, and we have the two male gametes here, or the male nuclei, and at the tip we have the tube nucleus. I'll call it TN, the tube nucleus. Now, what is the function of the tube nucleus? As the pollen tube is formed, the tube nucleus will produce certain enzymes which dissolves the tissue of the stigma and the style, and it leads the tube nucleus will produce certain enzyme which dissolves the tissue of the style, so that the tube nucleus or the pollen tube will heads towards the space here of the ovary that is called the micropyle. It is known as the micropyle. Now what happens is, as the tube nucleus reaches the micropyle, the tube nucleus will now reach the tip of the ovary or the micropyle, the space here, and it will disintegrate now. It will just vanish. And one nuclei will divide into two. The second half of the nuclei will now divide into two male gametes over here. These are the male gametes. Okay, this is the pollen tube. So as it enters into the ovary of the gynoecium, what happens? These male nuclei or the male gametes will fuse with the egg cell. Now it fuses with the egg cell. As it reaches, it releases the male nuclei or the male gametes, and it fuses with the egg cell. And this fusion of the male and the female gamete is known as fertilization, which results in the formation of a single cell structure called the zygote. Now, after the fertilization, how are the seed formed? After fertilization, the sepals, the petals, the stamens, they all fall off. Only the ovary will be left. So the stigma and the style also withers away. The ovary containing ovules, each with a fertilized egg or the zygote, continues to grow, and this zygote divides into two and grows into an embryo. So the zygote, now the single-celled structure which is known as the zygote, will now start developing into an embryo, which has two cotyledons and an embryonic axis. So the fertilized and the developed ovule changes into seed. So the ovules inside the ovary will now give rise to the seed. So fruit is nothing but the ripened ovary. So this, for all the rest of the portion of the flower will disintegrate. Only the ovary is left. Now this ovary normally will start now growing into a fruit which consists of seeds. For example, papaya, we talk about mango, we talk about any vegetable like tomatoes, we talk about brinjal, we talk about ladyfinger, and so many other chili, so many other fruits and vegetables. These are actually the ripened ovary, and we call it a fruit. So fruit is nothing but a ripened ovary, and ovules are nothing. Seeds are nothing but ripened ovules. Please remember that. So a seed is a fertilized and mature ovule, and which can grow into a new plant under favorable conditions. Now the fruit formation. The fruit is a ripened ovary that contains one or more seeds. So a fruit can be fleshy and dry depending upon the wall. For example, if it is fleshy, like for example mango, it's a fleshy plant, it's a fleshy fruit, whereas pea is a dry fruit. So with this, we come to the sexual reproduction in plants. So I hope you've understood. So thank you for watching. We'll continue with the other chapters in biology in the next class. Thank you so much.